I'm here with Prince Harry. Prince Harry. Harry.
Yes, I actually said you can call me whatever you want.
Okay.
The decision has been a surprise.
For years, the warning existed only in guarded conversations and behind doors Meghan believed had permanently closed. But when a seemingly harmless move exposed a hidden pattern, palace insiders remembered what Charles had predicted and realized the consequences were no longer approaching. They had already begun. Charles had never believed the greatest danger would arrive through one explosive interview or one public confrontation. Those storms could be managed. Headlines faded. Statements were issued. But privately, he feared something far more difficult to contain, that once Meghan felt free from royal control, she would still be unable to leave royal history untouched. The warning was reportedly made while Harry and Meghan were negotiating their future outside the monarchy. Every conversation was tense. Every compromise carried emotional weight. Charles watched his son moving further away, yet his concern stretched beyond separation. He feared that any kindness offered during those negotiations might later be retold as cruelty, while every restriction could be presented as punishment. At first, senior advisors treated his fears as those of a wounded father. Harry was leaving. Meghan felt trapped. Charles was preparing to lose both access and influence. But he insisted the real crisis would not come immediately. It would come later, after Meghan became convinced that the palace was too cautious, too divided, and too frightened of public criticism to challenge her. Then came the move that changed everything. Publicly, it seemed innocent, another personal decision tied to Meghan's independent future. Yet buried within it was language carrying the unmistakable echo of private royal discussions. There was a phrase, a symbol, and a suggestion of access that palace officials believed had never been given for independent use. No accusation followed. No angry statement was released. Instead, aides quietly returned to old messages, meeting notes, dates, and assurances made during the Sussex negotiations. One similarity might have been coincidence. Two could be dismissed. But as the pieces were placed together, a troubling pattern emerged. Harry found himself caught inside that silence. His instinct was to defend Meghan, as he had done through every previous storm. Yet the objections coming from the palace sounded painfully familiar. They echoed arguments Charles had made years earlier, warnings Harry had dismissed as fear, control, and resistance to change. What made the situation more dangerous was the suggestion that the palace possessed more than suspicion. Somewhere in its records sat a carefully worded condition, an old agreement, or a private warning Meghan may have believed would never be revealed. Charles had not predicted that Meghan would simply attack the monarchy. He had predicted that she would eventually expose herself by reaching for something the crown had deliberately left within view. And to understand why Charles believed that moment was inevitable, the story must return to the private negotiations where Meghan thought she had secured her freedom, but may instead have accepted the very condition now closing around her. The public saw a royal departure framed as freedom, independence, and a search for peace. Behind palace doors, however, every concession carried a condition, every promise concealed a fear, and one carefully phrased understanding would later become the foundation of Charles' warning and Meghan's most dangerous miscalculation. The negotiations surrounding Harry and Meghan's exit were never merely about duties, funding, or where they would live. They became a struggle over identity. Who owned the Sussex story? Who controlled the meaning of their royal years? And could two people leave the institution while still carrying its power into a new life? Meghan entered those discussions determined not to surrender everything. She wanted freedom from the rules governing working royals, but she also understood the value of the titles, global attention, charitable influence, and prestige attached to the crown. In her view, the palace could not demand silence while continuing to benefit from her connection to the family. Her profile had grown beyond Britain. She believed it could no longer be contained by courtiers. Charles faced a crueler calculation. He was a father watching Harry pull away, a future king preparing to inherit responsibility, and a guardian of an institution that could not allow private royal access to become a commercial possession. Every concession risked weakening the monarchy. Every refusal risked losing his son. Somewhere inside those tense exchanges, an understanding was allegedly formed. Private conversations, family communications, ceremonial knowledge, royal symbols, invitations, and titles could not be repackaged in ways suggesting continued palace approval. It was not written like a threat. There was no dramatic sentence announcing punishment. Its power rested in careful wording, quiet expectation, and the belief that everyone understood the line between personal memory and institutional property. Meghan understood that line differently. To her, leaving meant reclaiming her experience. She believed marriage had made royal history part of her own life, and no advisor had the right to decide which memories she could discuss or which identity she was allowed to carry forward. Harry saw his father's caution as another attempt to limit Meghan. Charles saw something darker, his son slowly surrendering judgment to anger, grievance, and the need to defend every decision. One senior advisor reportedly warned that undefined boundaries would eventually be tested. Charles' answer was coldly precise. The decisive mistake, he believed, would come when Meghan confused palace silence with palace consent. And buried within the understanding was one particular phrase, linked to a private assurance of future reconciliation. It appeared insignificant then. Later, it would become the detail that changed everything. For a time, Charles's warning seemed overly severe until Meghan began rebuilding her public identity, piece by piece, using royal echoes that the palace noticed even when the public did not. Meghan's new life appeared polished, independent, and carefully separated from the institution she had accused of causing so much pain. Yet beneath every reinvention, palace observers detected familiar language, inherited prestige, and symbols of royal proximity until independence itself began to look like something built from the crown's shadow. She moved quickly to shape a new identity. Media projects promised truth. Public appearances presented confidence. Carefully controlled interviews turned pain into purpose, while philanthropic campaigns and lifestyle ventures offered a story of survival followed by triumph. Meghan was no longer simply explaining why she left. She was building an empire around what came after. But one contradiction refused to disappear. The more firmly she claimed to have moved beyond royal life, the more attention followed whenever she spoke about titles, family conflict, palace treatment, or the private world she had entered through marriage. Her independence was celebrated, yet much of its power still came from the institution she said she had escaped. Inside the palace, officials noticed. They began quietly recording repeated references to ceremonial traditions, private conversations, emotional family moments, and language carrying the weight of royal authority. No single example appeared decisive. Together, however, they kept the crown attached to every stage of Meghan's reinvention. That tension may also have existed within Meghan herself. She wanted to be recognized as a successful woman in her own right, not merely as someone who had married a prince. Yet surrendering the title of Duchess of Sussex would also mean surrendering the global prestige that made every new venture impossible to ignore. Harry supported her rise because he needed it to prove their departure had achieved something. Her success became evidence that leaving had been worth the sacrifice. Still, unease began to grow when intimate family experiences seemed to appear at exactly the moments public interest required new fuel. Behind this conflict stood an unspoken comparison with Catherine, Princess of Wales. Catherine's influence came through continuity, patience, and disciplined silence. Meghan's came through revelation, challenge, and disruption. They represented two opposing forms of royal power, and only one remained protected by the institution. Charles watched without responding. He understood that an open confrontation could strengthen Meghan's claim that the palace feared her voice. So the silence continued, but it was not weakness. Advisors were allowing the pattern to form, waiting until Meghan's own choices became more convincing than any accusation. Then she touched something different, a phrase linked to the exit negotiations, guarded because it carried the promise of future trust. Then came the decision that changed the atmosphere entirely, a move Meghan may have considered clever, symbolic, and impossible to challenge, but one the palace immediately recognized as the moment Charles had predicted. It did not arrive as an explosive interview or a public accusation. It appeared quietly, wrapped in elegant language, and presented as another step in Meghan's independent future. But inside the palace, the reaction was immediate, because hidden within that polished announcement was a detail she had once promised not to use. The announcement introduced a new project built around heritage, personal renewal, and the power of carrying tradition into a different future. To the public, it seemed harmless. The language was warm, emotional, and broad enough to feel deeply personal. Supporters praised Meghan for reclaiming her identity and turning years of pressure into something she could finally control. But palace advisors heard something else. At the center of the message was a phrase tied to a private discussion held during the Sussex departure negotiations. It had never appeared in a public statement. It belonged to a confidential proposal involving future reconciliation, charitable influence, and Meghan's possible relationship with royal tradition outside official duties. To those who had been present, the resemblance was unmistakable. The phrase mattered because it carried more than emotional weight. It linked royal heritage with the authority to continue a family tradition. It suggested access, approval, and a connection to the crown that Meghan's independent project had not officially received. This was not simply about money or branding. It was about who had the right to inherit meaning, and who could speak as though that inheritance had been granted. Charles received the briefing with copies of the announcement placed beside notes from the earlier meetings. The similarities were too exact to dismiss. Some advisors demanded an immediate response, warning that silence could be interpreted as permission. Others urged restraint, fearing that legal threats or public condemnation would allow Meghan to present herself as the target of another palace campaign. William was far less patient. To him, the move confirmed that private concessions had once again been turned into public advantage. Yet Charles remained calm, not because he considered the matter small, but because he understood what it meant. The line had finally been crossed. Then the palace contacted Harry with one direct question. Had he approved the use of the protected material? His hesitation changed everything. Defending Meghan now meant claiming knowledge he might not possess. But admitting uncertainty meant accepting that she may have made the decision without telling him where its most powerful language came from. Charles asked for the original confidential warning to be retrieved. When Charles' original words were placed beside Meghan's latest move, the resemblance was impossible to ignore, and the secret warning finally revealed why the king had never believed the Sussex conflict was truly over. Charles had not predicted another interview, another family accusation, or another wave of public outrage. His warning was far more precise. Meghan would eventually reuse something entrusted to her privately, believing the palace could never respond without exposing its own secrets. Now, every part of that prediction had come true. The original warning was brutally specific. Charles allegedly believed Meghan would one day take a private assurance, ceremonial tradition, confidential phrase, or carefully limited concession, and present it publicly as part of her own story. Not as borrowed royal language, not as a conditional offer, but as something she had earned, inherited, or created for herself. He also understood why she might believe the move was safe. The palace rarely explained private negotiations. It protected conversations even when silence damaged its reputation. Charles feared Meghan would eventually choose something the monarchy could not challenge, without revealing the very secrets it had spent years hiding. Then, the records were opened. Archived notes from the departure meetings reportedly showed that Meghan had been told the disputed phrase could only be used within an approved family or institutional setting. A later message repeated the condition. One witness remembered the warning clearly. The language represented a possible bridge back to royal cooperation, not permission for an independent project. That was why palace officials considered Meghan caught again. To them, this was connected to earlier moments when private conversations, family memories, and internal decisions had been retold without the conditions surrounding them. Each time, Meghan's version stood alone because the monarchy refused to answer. Her defense, however, was immediate and powerful. She had never surrendered ownership of her experiences. The phrase reflected her life, her marriage, and ideas she believed she had helped shape. The crown, she argued, could not own memories or emotions simply because they had been discussed behind palace doors. But the complication was devastating. The protected material had not been offered as a gift. It had been shared conditionally during an attempt to preserve the possibility of reconciliation. Using it publicly made that trust appear exploited before it had even been restored. Harry finally understood the danger. He had defended the project as entirely independent, only to discover that its strongest element may have come from a private exchange with his father. Charles felt no victory. His warning had been proven right, but so had his deepest fear that Harry was now further away than ever. He refused a public attack. Instead, he ordered every informal channel, private permission, and reconciliation proposal to be reviewed. Meghan's greatest danger was no longer exposure. It was the palace's conclusion that nothing confidential could safely be shared with either of them again. The warning had come true, but the exposure was only the beginning, because Charles' next response would not be loud, emotional, or public. It would be colder, quieter, and far more difficult for Meghan and Harry to reverse. There was no furious palace statement, no televised condemnation, and no dramatic stripping of titles. Instead, invitations stopped moving, private messages went unanswered, and one proposed path back into the family quietly disappeared. Charles did not declare a punishment. He simply removed the trust that made reconciliation possible. The king understood that public retaliation would give Meghan something she knew how to fight. An accusation could be challenged. A statement could be dissected. A threat could be transformed into another story of palace cruelty. So Charles chose distance instead, controlled, quiet, and almost impossible to confront. A private meeting that had once been discussed was suddenly suspended. So was a possible family invitation that might have allowed Harry to return without cameras, speeches, or formal negotiations. No replacement date was offered. No dramatic explanation followed. Palace aides used only one restrained phrase: the arrangement could not continue while questions of trust remain unresolved. Those words carried enormous weight. Nothing had been officially cancelled forever, yet the responsibility had been placed directly upon Harry and Meghan. The palace had not publicly condemned them. It had simply made clear that the next move was no longer Charles to make. Meghan recognized the danger immediately. Public criticism could be answered through interviews, carefully timed statements, and supportive voices. Silent exclusion was different. It had no face, no single decision, and no obvious target. It denied her the confrontation through which she had repeatedly regained control. Harry tried to reach his father directly, but the old access was gone. Calls were redirected. Messages passed through officials. Emotional conversations became written summaries, stripped of warmth and carefully preserved. William supported every restriction. He argued that access to the king, royal homes, private occasions, and confidential information could not continue when each gesture risked becoming a future disclosure or commercial symbol. His position, came from anger and duty. Charles's came from something sadder: exhaustion. The king no longer feared only another scandal. He feared that one more private attempt to heal the family would be taken apart, repackaged, and placed before the world. Meghan believed the palace was punishing her through secrecy while avoiding accountability. Her instinct was to respond, to place a message, reveal another detail, and force the monarchy into the open. But this time, Harry hesitated. Another escalation might destroy the last thread connecting him to his father. As the palace tightened its silence, the pressure moved inside the Sussex marriage, where Harry and Meghan were forced to confront a question neither could easily answer: who had truly known where the disputed material came from? Harry had defended Meghan against newspapers, courtiers, relatives, and an institution he believed had failed them both. But this time, the threat did not come from an anonymous source. It came from a question he could not silence. Had Meghan crossed the line knowingly and allowed him to defend her without the full truth? Until that moment, Harry's loyalty had rested on one unshakable belief: whatever came against them, they faced it together. The palace was the enemy. The pressure was shared. Their version of events was united. But now, a fracture had appeared inside that certainty. Harry had known about the project. What he may not have known was where its most powerful language had come from, or what private restrictions Charles had attached to it. That difference was no longer technical. It cut directly into trust. Meghan insisted the phrase belonged to their shared experience. It had emerged from conversations about their future, their pain, and the life they were trying to rebuild. Asking palace permission, she argued, would have surrendered the independence they had fought to protect. Harry's concern was narrower, but more dangerous. The question was not whether the monarchy owned their memories. It was whether Meghan had knowingly used something Charles shared during a private attempt at reconciliation, and then allowed Harry to defend it as completely separate from the palace. That possibility reopened every wound between father and son. Years of distance, resentment, and unresolved grief came rushing back. Charles's warning now felt unbearable because it suggested his father had understood the danger long before Harry was willing to see it. Meghan wanted a strong public response. She believed the controversy should be exposed as another attempt to intimidate and control them. Harry resisted. Another statement, he feared, would prove the palace's claim that no private exchange could remain private. His hesitation wounded Meghan. To her, it looked like the return of the fearful prince she believed had escaped royal obedience. To Harry, however, silence was no longer surrender. It was the only way to protect the last fragile possibility of speaking to his father again. Then details of their disagreement began leaking, turning private tension into public speculation. Harry finally made one demand before lending his name to Meghan's defense. He wanted to see the original documents himself. Harry's demand for proof changed the balance completely. Because the documents did more than confirm Charles's warning, they exposed who inside the palace had been preparing for Meghan's move long before it happened. Meghan believed she had surprised the palace, forcing it into another defensive silence. But the records Harry requested revealed something colder. A senior royal figure had tracked every repeated phrase, disputed memory, and symbolic claim for years, waiting for the moment when the pattern would become impossible to deny. The record had been built quietly by a trusted palace figure with access to private correspondence, meeting summaries, public statements, and the conditions attached to sensitive royal offers. Every promise was dated. Every restriction was preserved. Every contradiction was placed beside the words that had come before it. It was not created for public revenge. Its purpose was protection. The monarchy knew that memory could become a weapon when different sides recalled the same conversation in completely different ways. The archive ensured there would always be a record of what had been offered, what had been refused, and what had never been approved. Several earlier incidents had nearly activated Charles's warning. Private family moments had entered public discussion. Internal decisions had been described without the circumstances surrounding them. Yet each episode left room for doubt. There was suspicion, but no decisive proof that a protected boundary had knowingly been crossed. The latest move changed that. Its language matched a confidential exchange known only to a small circle. The similarities were not broad or accidental. They carried the structure and meaning of a proposal that had never been made public. William and other senior royals had reportedly warned Charles that informal contact with the Sussexes was becoming too dangerous. Emotional conversations, they feared, could later be separated from their original purpose and transformed into public evidence. Charles resisted because ending those conversations completely would mean abandoning Harry. When Harry examined the accumulated record, anger came first. He felt watched, studied, and judged by an institution that had documented his family's pain like a legal dispute. But discomfort soon followed. Many entries corresponded to controversies he had publicly dismissed as palace hostility. Meghan rejected the archive's authority. To her, it recorded only the institution's version of events while ignoring the fear, isolation, and emotional damage she believed had shaped every decision. Now there was another threat. If those records leaked, the dispute could become an international battle over confidentiality, titles, branding, and the commercial value of royal identity. Charles faced a final choice: keep the evidence sealed to protect his son, or allow the truth behind his warning to defend the crown. That decision would determine far more than Meghan's reputation, because the final battle was no longer about one disputed move. It was about whether the Sussexes could remain connected to the monarchy without access to its trust. Meghan had survived criticism before, transforming every attack into proof that she remained powerful enough to threaten the palace. But this time, the monarchy did not need to defeat her publicly. It only needed to convince Charles that trust was impossible, and that realization could cost Harry and Meghan more than any headline. The final consequence was not the loss of a title or another damaging week of coverage. It was something quieter and more permanent. Harry and Meghan could remain connected to the monarchy through blood, marriage, history, and public identity while losing access to the private family life behind it. Charles's warning had turned reconciliation into a risk. Every compassionate call could become a future account. Every invitation might later be interpreted as approval. Even a private attempt to heal old wounds could provide new material for another public conflict. Trust was no longer simply damaged. Inside the palace, it was being treated as dangerous. Meghan refused to show weakness. Her public position remained firm. She had done nothing wrong, surrendered none of her experiences, and would not allow an ancient institution to decide how she described her own life. To supporters, the controversy was another effort to control a woman who had rejected royal obedience. Behind that confidence, however, uncertainty began to grow. Advisors and commercial partners had to consider whether future projects could continue drawing upon royal associations without provoking legal threats, palace resistance, or reputational damage. The connection that had once guaranteed attention was becoming harder to use safely. For Harry, the cost was deeply personal. The freedom he chose now came with permanent suspicion. Any future message to his father could be filtered through officials. Every attempt to return might be judged against the warning Charles had made years earlier. William saw the incident as proof that stronger boundaries were essential. Titles, archives, correspondence, invitations, ceremonial knowledge, and the involvement of non-working royals would all require tighter control. Charles faced the cruelest consequence of all. Protecting the crown might force him to become the cold, distant father Harry had always believed him to be. Yet Meghan may still possess records, memories, and private exchanges of her own. She was not caught, because the palace suddenly became stronger. She was caught because Charles waited for her to repeat the behavior he had predicted would expose the limits of her independence. The monarchy may have sealed one door, but Meghan's silence did not necessarily mean surrender. It may have meant she was deciding which secret to release next.